And good evening, everyone. Tonight, my guest is Australian social media commentator with a difference. He has the background to support his statements, and strangely enough, despite extensive military training and experience, doesn't seem to agree with the narrative that China is a threat to Australia, nor does he think that Putin is a madman who sent the army to Ukraine unprovoked, or that October the 7th was an isolated incident that started the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. In short, an intelligent, experienced, and trained observer who does not fit the media narratives, the geopolitical narratives anyway, that most Western governments and media are putting out there. So let's try and find out why, and what he knows that most Australian journalists and perhaps some politicians seem to be missing. So welcome, Cameron Leckie. How are you tonight?
G'day, Jerry. I'm very well, and thanks very much for having me on your show. Just let's say before we get into it that I used to think we could sort of reform the mainstream sort of media and that. I don't think that's any possible any longer. So programs such as what you're doing and many others, I think, are becoming ever more increasingly important and also valuable to our society. So thank you for the work you do.
Well, thank you. I started doing this for fun, and it got a little more serious than I planned. It really was supposed to be the bike riding. You can see there's a truck there with the Taklamakan Desert behind me. That's one of the roads we've cycled down. That's what I was trying to show when I started this, and it got very, very political. So it's been an interesting ride for me. So you served in the Australian Army. You studied in Duntroon, the military college, which is kind of, for Americans, that's our West Point. That's Sandhurst for the Brits. Duntroon is the pinnacle of military training, I think. But you're now in Civvy Street. So we're not going to talk about your Civvy Street stuff, but you are a proponent and you serve on the chair. You're the chair of the War Reforms Committee, is that right?
I'm a committee member.
Yeah. Committee member. So give us a little bit of your background so that we can get an understanding that you are actually a well-informed observer.
Right, thanks, Jerry. So yeah, I joined the Army at 17 and a half, straight out of high school. So, finished high school in December, and end of January next year, I was in the Army. I went to the Defence Force Academy where you study a degree, and I did a Bachelor of Science, and then you go to Duntroon and do your full-time sort of military training. And yeah, I spent 24 years in the Australian Army. I guess I was destined to join the Army. My great-grandparents who served in the First World War. My dad's father served in the Royal Australian Air Force in World War II. He's in Ambon, and was evacuated just prior to it being captured by the Japanese. And if anyone knows that story, it's pretty horrific what happened thereafter with massacre of Australian soldiers. And my father was conscripted during the Vietnam era. He didn't go to Vietnam, but he's conscripted. He spent 30 plus years in the Citizens Military Force and then the Australian Army Reserve. So, I was always heading that direction. I was going to join the Army. I guess I think I had like two halves to my career, like from a mental standpoint. The first half, I was all in. I thought, freedom, democracy, Australia, United States. I thought we're all, we're leading the world. We're heading in the right direction, and what we did was good for the world, good for our country. And so of course, during the course of my military career, there's certain things that happened which sort of set us off in a different direction. I guess Iraq in 2003 was the starting point of that. I deployed overseas a couple of times. I went to East Timor when they got their independence from Indonesia. I went to the Solomon Islands after they had some hoo-ha over there, and also went to Indonesia and Sumatra after the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004 and 5. But I didn't go to the Middle East, and I'm quite thankful about that now. And I guess over the course of a good many years, because it's quite a challenging thing when you realise things you've believed in mightn't necessarily be the truth or that. And so by the second half of my military career, I was really questioning with ever increasing frequency, what we're hearing in the media, what our Defence Force was stood for, what it was doing. And I guess by the end of that 24 years, I really felt that I was no longer, not saying I have nothing against the Australian Defence Force, and I think the Australian Defence Force is an important institution and does a lot of good things. But when push comes to shove, what we're here for is to support the interests of the United States, and that's something I could no longer participate in. So I made the decision to leave the army.
Wow. So tell us a little bit about the War Reforms Committee.
Yeah, so a couple of years after I left, I hadn't really had much. I saw a few tweets and stuff that didn't really have much to do with them. But now I got contacted by a member and had a chat and sort of thought, well, that's something I believe in. And, I guess one of the things, there's a few things I believe in. The United Nations Charter is one of them. Democracy is another. And when it comes to war powers, the decision to take Australian troops and put them into an overseas conflict, it's fundamentally undemocratic the way that's pursued in Australia. So the Prime Minister alone, as happened in the Iraq War, can take Australia to war. And I don't think that's democratic. I don't think it's a good way of making decisions on such important matters, particularly when we're sending troops overseas, because we're not actually defending Australia, we're defending our interests. And how do you define those interests on the far side of the world? And more often than not, those interests are then just aligned with the alliance with the United States. So, I think it's contrary. We got the examples. I think since the Iraq War, there's something like 80 or 90 pieces of national security legislation that have been enacted in Australia, all of which have contributed to clamping down on freedoms and that you expect in a democratic society. And that all root of all that triggered from one man's decision to take us to a war, which we now know was illegal and based on a whole bunch of lies.
Wow. So you think that war reform or military defense reform, perhaps is a better word, I think, than war reform, defense reform is contingent on democratic reform as well?
Yes, I do. There's a lady, Bronwyn Kelly, who's written quite extensively on how our democratic system isn't that democratic, and I can't speak anywhere near as well on that as what she can. But yes, I think it's like war is the most important decision any government can ever make, and if that's not subject to the proper democratic process, i.e., a vote by the Parliament on such an important decision, then everything else sort of falling underneath that is also at risk. So I think it's the number one issue we need to sort out as far as getting our democracy in order, for the benefit of Australians.
Do you think that this is an off-the-cuff question? In the democratic process, if we were to take this democratic process and say there's a discussion or a debate about going to war in Iraq or currently in Yemen, let's say Yemen, for example, because that's actually a bubbling potential. If it went to the Parliament for a debate, for a discussion, and for a vote, do you think that the Parliament is still democratic enough to say what it really needs, or what Australia really needs, as opposed to what the individual members prefer?
Yeah. Well, I guess just because we refer it to the Parliament, might still end up in the same outcome. But as part of that process, there's the debate, there's the accountability, there's the transparency, and I guess, and Yemen's a handy example here, which we'll get to shortly. But yeah, you have that transparency, and when we go to war, Australia, because other than World War II, when the Japanese bombed, several times in submarines into Sydney Harbour and that, Australia hasn't actually been threatened. So when we go to war overseas, it's about something else other than the immediate defence of Australia. So that means the bar we need to jump over to justify that, I think, is a much higher than, obviously, if you're attacked, 100% we need to defend ourselves, and I have no problem with that. But if you're going to send your forces overseas, I think the bar should be that much higher. And a debate in the Parliament, ending in a vote to make that decision, I think that's a good. We need an effective government. We need to be able to act in a timely fashion. If you went to a referendum or something like that, I think I don't necessarily think that would end up in a better decision. And certainly, if there is a good reason we should be deploying forces overseas, well, we don't want to put that additional hurdle in the way. But I think a good informed debate by the Parliament to make a decision, and then the parliament is accountable, and they're accountable to their electorates. Well, I think that's a much better system than what we currently have.
I get that. We put the politicians in there to make those decisions on our behalf, and we trust them to do that. In theory, we trust them to do that. So in practice, all they need to do is to say, somebody needs to ask the question, what national interest are we defending? And that's why we should go to war. And once that's out there, people will have differences of opinions on it, but at least we know what we're fighting for. That would probably be the only way that I would view that. If we know what the defense issue is, we're fighting here because the Taiwan thing will come to that in a little while. They're going to roll across Taiwan and invade Australia soon. I think that's something I've heard many Australians say.
Because if you look at our recent military history, really the only reason we have done anything overseas is to support the alliance. And we can get to that later, but that is the only reason.
Well, let's go into the topics that we've set aside a couple of questions here that we're going to discuss specifically. 3 major conflicts going on at the moment. Ukraine is one, of course. Gaza is another. They're kinetic wars. They're very hard to say that there's not a real war going on there. But the third is a trade, diplomatic, financial, and media war with China. And I think we should talk about each of them separately. Let's start with Ukraine. What's going on now? And do you see an outcome to this?
Yeah, I'd probably like just to go back a bit.
Okay.
That contextualizes how I viewed my take on what's happening. I guess if we look at the conventional wisdom in the Australian media or the Western media about what's happening, is that there was an unprovoked invasion by Russia against Ukraine, and that the Russians, they almost took Kiev, but they didn't because of stout Ukrainian resistance. Then they withdrew, and then the Russians were spread thin, and the Ukrainians had a couple of counteroffensives. So they took around Kherson and Kharkiv, and they retook that country, that part of the Ukrainian territory. And then now the build up to the Ukrainian offensive, which was blown up to be something that was going to be win the war. That was defeated mightily by the Russians. It was a complete failure, a catastrophe. And now the narrative sort of spinning. They're trying to work out what the narrative is, because Ukraine's just lost Avdiivka, which took 10 years to fortify. Was bombing Donetsk on a daily basis during the lead up to the war, and so now the narrative's sort of churning again. And I think if we look at that sort of, I guess that was just the sort of key snapshots of the narrative to get to this point. To believe that, you have to ignore a mountain of evidence to the contrary. So, sometimes worry about what words you can say, but the certain political party.
Well, I'm not monetized, so don't worry about offending my monetization. Go for it.
So, prior to the war, or as in, I guess the current phase of the war in Ukraine started in February 2022. Pretty much every major organisation, media organisation in the Western media and human rights groups spoke about the tendency of certain groups in Ukraine to follow a certain German political party of the 1930s. And once the invasion started, that is now Russian propaganda. So to me, there's a massive disconnect. All the a mountain of evidence saying this is an issue, this is an issue. All of a sudden, bang! No, from this day forward, it's no longer an issue. So that's one. The Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, they had a monitoring mission in the Donbass from basically 2014 onwards. And if you go through the data, which is all available on their website, 70% of the casualties from that occurred in eastern part of the Donbass, i.e. I don't like the term separatist, but let's just use the term separatist for this point. 70% occurred there. Therefore, they were caused by the Ukrainian military. And the other 30%, obviously, in retaliation. And then in the lead up, the very days prior, the same OSCE reports put a 1,000-fold increase in the number of ceasefire violations by the Ukrainians. So these are facts. We can talk about, there's facts, there's assumptions and judgments. That's sort of one of the things in our military planning process we talk about. These are things that are facts. And then what we need to do is make some judgments and assumptions about what happened. So to me, the unprovoked thing, and I mean, you can talk about the 30 years from the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Wolfowitz Doctrine, etc. You can talk about all those things. But the immediate days prior to the Russians invading Ukraine, there's an enormous spike in ceasefire violations. Now, why does media not cover that? I mean, the evidence is there. Why is it not covered? They don't cover it because it doesn't suit the narrative of the unprovoked and that. So that is, you couldn't have any clearer immediate provocation than what happened there. I guess another example is Minsk, the Minsk Accord. So, that was adopted by the United Nations Security Council. And so, it has the force of international law. And we find out since the war started, or the current phase of the war has started, that President Hollande in France, Chancellor Merkel, President Poroshenko, and President Zelensky have all publicly stated that Minsk was just a means to buy time for Ukraine to prepare. So once again, when we get these public statements, it's hard to how the logical conclusion is that this was all part of a provocation, of which we don't actually know what the internal objectives, what they were trying to achieve was. But to say the war was unprovoked, I think is just ignoring the evidence. It's ahistorical to say that the war was unprovoked. So I guess that's sort of how I've, and there's obviously much more to it. And I guess the other thing I like to raise is we're only getting one narrative in the media, and as soon as there's someone counter to that, it's like Russian propaganda. But there's the very fact you have people like John Mearsheimer, like Jeffrey Sachs, and a whole bunch of other people having well-developed, logical, coherent arguments to say this was provoked. And then the other side, the conventional side, saying it was an unprovoked illegal invasion, blah, blah, Russian imperialism, blah, blah, blah. Like, there's two sides to this. And when you only consider one side, you can tell there's more to it than just, unprovoked. They're obviously spinning a narrative.
In my opinion, the banning of the other side as fake news. Now, there may very well be. In every war, there's always going to be what they call the fake news. But they've actually banned anyone they've banned it from being watched. If you're in America, you need a VPN to watch Russia Today, for example. If you're in China, you need a VPN to watch the BBC. But you expect that in China. You don't expect that in America. In the land of free speech, they're saying, we're going to make decisions on what's real and what's not real for you. So we're going to close this avenue of exploration, if you want, or critical thinking. Let's have a look at both sides and see which one we think is right.
I can't remember where I read it, but I read somewhere that a British intelligence officer in Yugoslavia during the NATO activities that happened there, was questioning his superior, saying, if our cause is just, why do we need to lie about what the UK, NATO, etc. were doing in Yugoslavia? And I think that's relevant here. If our cause is just, why do we need to, let's not say lie, but why do we need to basically not allow a separate argument to, if what we were doing was legitimate and could be argued on its merits, they wouldn't need to do all this censorship. And that's another, big red flag to me. Like if we were doing things for good reasons, i.e. we were actually there, we're actually interested in supporting Ukraine, they wouldn't need to cover all this up. But I think that just highlights that this is actually a proxy war, and they're taking the opportunity, whether that was an opportunity or was deliberately engineered. I really don't. I haven't got a firm judgment on that, but I think it's one of those two to weaken Russia, and hence why they need to have all these information operations and manipulation of the narrative to make sure that the public doesn't get up in arms and start asking the questions that sort of things that I raise.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Where do you think it's going to go? Now we're in the speculation and opinion field.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many variables, and particularly I step back, I read the Western media. I don't actually read Russian or Chinese. Every now and then I look at RT or CGTN or something, but very rarely. Like pretty much most of what I read is Western media and Western commentators. And my take on the I guess the global majority or the BRICS countries, it's very business-like. They're going about their business constructively, trying to build things for the future, for the betterment of their people. Then I look at what the Western powers are doing, and it's all theatre. And why is it theatre? We can maybe get into that a bit later. But as a result, we're not really dealing with people who are pragmatic. I think we're dealing with ideologues, and as a result, they're unpredictable. I mean, the neocons, they seem to be, they are just all guns blazing ahead. There's no backwards gear. There's no slowing down. And so that really quite concerns me because, that means that they could make some decisions which, bring us to World War III, bring us to nuclear conflict, rather than saying, all right, this is a lost cause. They need to be pragmatic, strike a deal, and end this now. So I certainly hope that's not where we end up. That's a big motivation why I sort of do what I do on Twitter and the articles I write and stuff like that, is because I've got a family, I've got kids, and I'd like them to have a long, healthy life. And
yeah. Well, you're quite lucky that you're in a place that's not really a target yet, but it does certainly point towards that direction.
No, that's right. So I guess that's the big. I mean, so I'm not going to. I don't think we can make predictions because there's too many irrational factors involved. But I guess in general terms, I find it very difficult to believe that anything other than the Russians will impose their will on Ukraine and basically NATO. So how much of Ukraine Russia ends up taking, what Ukraine looks like afterwards, I have no inside knowledge of what the Kremlin's thinking or that, so it's all supposition. But I guess my general takeaway is that Ukraine has been defeated. Like they're holding on, but they have no capacity to win. And really, I think what's going on now is manoeuvring about how to, both internally within Ukraine and the West, as to, how to manoeuvre to, have the best possible look of whatever ends up happening. So,
what the Chinese would say, how to get out of it and keep face.
Exactly. Yeah. I guess I'll just make two comments. So, one on casualties and then one on training. So, I'd spent 18 of my years in the army. I was in training jobs, and I really enjoyed training. But I was thinking about it today, like one of the courses I was an instructor on was the officer course for majors. So we taught them the planning process, the military appreciation process, and we used the Missourians as our training enemy. So it's a make-believe enemy, but we had their doctrine, their equipment and structure. And guess what they looked remarkably like?
It was either Russia or China.
Very much like a Soviet Union motor rifle division or something like that. Exactly the same equipment, exactly the same organization, exactly the same tactics.
Just change the name and the color of the flag.
Yeah, pretty much. So we have a new training enemy now, and I haven't really kept up with it. But that was certainly the Missourians were our old training enemy. And, the amount of firepower they had compared to our army was quite considerable advantage. But just on that training side, that course that we ran was 6 weeks, and 5 of those 6 weeks was on operational, so doing scenarios, very much conventional war fighting, not with all the drones and things we had happening in Ukraine now, but the similar sort of high intensity conflict. And that was a 6-week course for people who've been in the army probably 10 or 12 years, and would have done, in total could have done, several years worth of formal training over that time, plus all their day-to-day job, getting experience in a unit, planning activities, running exercises, and what you do in the army. So that's just one course in the Australian Army's training continuum. And that is more than what a Ukrainian soldier is getting before they're thrown into combat against, into the most significant conventional conflict we've had probably since the Korean War. So I find it very difficult to see how Ukraine, given that circumstance, has any ability to be able to generate the capability, so the trained soldiers, and not just, it's not just soldiers, but it's the commanders, it's the staff who organise and plan things, the whole system to come together. You can't do that on the fly. That takes decades of a military organisation to build. So they're struggling, and they will struggle. And from what I can tell from the Russians is that they're capacity to train 100,000 or more soldiers every year. When they did their mobilisation, they were taking already, so soldiers already served in the army, they're bringing them back, and then they were giving them months and months and months of combined arms training to bring them back to scratch, to work in a team. And from what I understand, still a lot of them haven't been committed to the conflict. And when they are, they're rotated regularly, so that they're getting experience, but also the rest and recuperation to recover from that high intensity conflict. So I think that's two comparison there for training. Is that the Ukrainians have no hope of defeating the Russians from that perspective.
Wow. So it's either a peace or an ignoble defeat, or it's got to be something.
That's right. It's cannon fodder. It's literally cannon fodder. These people are getting thrown into the meat grinder is a terrible term, but that's the case with little hope of survival, and that leads to the firepower. Like, you don't have to read any Russian sources. All the Western sources, starting from about June last year, where they had that Rusi piece on the return of industrial warfare, is saying that Russia outguns Ukraine, has more weapons, has more ammunition. Its industrial capacity is much greater than the combined Wests. And so you've got poorly trained soldiers against soldiers who are much better trained, and you've got an army that has an enormous advantage in firepower. The only logical conclusion you can draw from that is that the Ukrainians are suffering far more casualties than the Russians are. And I suspect the longer this goes on, the bigger that ratio will get on, will come. So if it's like 3 or 4 to 1 now, and it's just plucking figures, it could go to 6, 7, 10 to 1 or something like that as the Ukrainians get weaker and weaker. So, I mean, it is illogical to me why they keep fighting. They need to come to terms sooner rather than later, because they won't have they're facing a demographic disaster over the next few decades. And the longer this fight goes on, they won't have a country left.
Part of the recovery is, Well, there's some argument there that they may not have a country already, with certain American corporations already taking over. But that's a different story. We're talking military here. Let's move on. You talked about cannon fodder. I want to move into the Middle East now. There's been talk very recently, up until today, in fact, that there may even be a ceasefire for the Ramadan period, I think. And I saw that Biden eating an ice cream a few days ago, saying, we're going to hear about something over the weekend, and by Monday there'll be a ceasefire. Of course, it's now Tuesday. There's still no ceasefire. My understanding is Hamas are in Egypt waiting to talk, and Israel are not sending people to talk. What's going on there? Question here. What actually is happening there right now? Do you know?
No, I think I'd probably prefer to talk about the bigger picture rather than to be honest, I haven't been following the day-to-day sort of what's happening, because I find it quite sickening. You see in your Twitter feed, and I find it really hard to actually watch. But I think Israel's dug itself a hole. The United States and its allies have dug itself a hole. So there's no good outcome, or there's no good outcome for anyone in this circumstance. And obviously, the longer it goes on, just the body count will continue to grow. But I think I think that the key things I'm drawing out of it is, first of all, that the Western world has lost any moral authority it may once have had with regards to this conflict. It's chalk and cheese. Like, obviously, you're well aware of the allegations made against China and how they've treated the Uyghurs, or the allegations how they've treated the Uyghurs, and how much hoo-ha there has been in the West about that. And then when the war in Ukraine started, about all the Russian atrocities and all allegations of atrocities, and then it comes to a body count which is far higher, far more quickly than what's occurred in Ukraine, which is just happening before our eyes. And our foreign minister Penny Wong said, early on, said, "Oh, it's hard to judge from a distance. Like they can make a judgment a day after Russia does something.
Yeah.
Weeks and months can go by. Oh, I can't make a judgment when it's against one of our allies." And I guess I've used this refrain quite a lot, but I think, the Western world only cares about human rights as long as there's a geopolitical angle to it. And that's why there's, the concerns about, and I think most of the concerns we are starting to see are faux concerns because like the public's expecting it. So it's for a domestic audience rather than a, just doing the right thing perspective.
Rather than protecting people in Gaza.
Yeah. So, and I guess it might be timely to mention that today it was announced that the
ICJ.
Certain members of the Australian government, so the Prime Minister, the Defence Minister, the Foreign Minister, and the opposition leader have all been referred to the International Criminal Court by a bunch of Australian, I think about 100 lawyers, solicitors, etc. So I started to read the document they've said, but I'm not all the way through. It's 90-odd pages long. But I know the Prime Minister has sort of waved it away, saying, his immediate response. But when I've started to read the document, I don't think it'll be waved away so easily. And it's pretty damning when people of that caliber. So we're not talking like someone like me is just having trying to do what they can. We're talking about people with legal training, a lot of expertise there making these claims. I think it's quite an indication of how far astray our political leadership's gone and what's happening in and around Israel.
Yeah, because the interesting thing about this is it actually encompasses both parties. It encompasses both sides of the political spectrum. So it's not a simple case of Australia's Prime Minister is leading Australia down a bad path. The whole of Australia is going down the bad path, but the people of Australia don't seem to agree.
Yeah, no, well, it's like I don't monitor that closely, but I think there's regular protests in the major capital cities, each weekend and that, supporting the Palestinians. I mean, I really, interesting, like, because our Prime Minister's made statements when he was a junior politician, support for Palestine, etc.
Yeah.
It's like quite amazing to see what happens when they're put in a position of power as to how their view and their actions and their rhetoric changes. I mean, I don't know. I'd imagine that many of these people, if they had no constraints, whatever they might be placed upon them, would 100% agree with, like, I think most people's view that the killing in Gaza needs to stop. But when they're put in that political system and, where those pressures and that are coming from, I don't know. What, are they being threatened, or is it groupthink, or I have no idea what the internal mechanisms are. But to me, it's just like, mass killing. It's got to stop. Like, it's got to stop. And that's the frustrating thing is I believe that, President Joe Biden with one phone call could make it stop if he cut off aid to Israel. That could stop it in days. But it just shows what the underlying motivations
if he cut off aid to Israel, would that cut off political donations to many of himself and many of his colleagues? Maybe that's the reason.
And
this is an interesting. This question's a throwback to what we were talking about before. The Australian Citizens Party and the War Powers Reform. I know that you know Robbie Barwick. Because I've seen the two of you interact from time to time. What about that? Is the Australian Citizens Party of the same kind of vein? I know that IPAN and the Australian Citizens Party have talked about it before.
Yeah. I mean, I do know Robbie. I'm not a member of any political party. I like to maintain my independence. So, But I think in the whole, I agree with a lot of the positions, and they produce some pretty valuable material. The Citizens Party have got their research team, and Robbie leads a lot of that, and they've done a lot of good work on highlighting, various issues. Some of them foreign, some of them domestic. Like a lot of good work on banking and post office bank and that. So yeah, I think they're doing a lot of good work and furthering some very decent causes. I don't think War Powers Reform would. We're an independent organisation. We wouldn't align with any political party. Certainly, we would support political parties who support War Powers reforms. And we have engaged with politicians of all persuasions. But it's unlikely. Well, not unlikely. It just wouldn't happen. It's not that the organisation would become fundamentally. It'd be self-sabotage act if we became aligned with a single political party. But the Citizens Party is doing some great work in a whole bunch of areas.
Yeah, so there's the War Powers Reform website if anybody wants to have a look at what they do. How many of your members there are ex-military? Is that a thing that ex-military people get into or not?
I couldn't answer that. Yeah, there are a number. There's a lot of ex-diplomats and that, but I couldn't actually answer that. There are a number of ex-serving people, but I couldn't get the stats on what proportion. It's a bit of an odd thing. Like I could see when I was in the army, is like we'd have protesters at the various training activities, sometimes out in the barracks and that, and like most soldiers aren't particularly political, especially younger ones, and it's sort of it's like, what are they going on about, sort of thing, when they see the protests and sort of it doesn't really get much engagement. And I think it's very difficult when you're serving in an organisation, and particularly people who've committed a long period of time. Like I did 24 years. There's people who spent 20, 30 years. It's very difficult when you're into that path, and then people are talking about issues such as War Powers Reform. It's a little bit, it took me a good number of years to get my head sorted as to how I saw things had changed. So it's that cognitive dissonance that occurs, and a lot of people just don't go through that. So it's a bit of a odd quandary, even though we have like we've lost I think over 500 suicides after the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which more than 10 to 1 ratio compared to those killed in combat. So it is an interesting thing. We have an undemocratic process which sent people to war for purposes other than the defence of Australia, which resulted in deaths in combat, but even far more deaths in, for people who've, suffering the trauma of war. So it's an interesting little psychological conundrum, and I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know I can answer that as to why more people aren't.
I have studied a little psychology, and I get exactly where you're coming from. You and I have a very similar conundrum in our lives. I was a police officer, and the big thing for me was working on the miners' strike in the UK. I was a 20-something-year-old police officer with a few years' service, and there I was kind of helping to destroy the mining industry, which is actually where my grandfather came from. My father was born into a mining town, mining village, mining family, and he went to sea, so he didn't go down the pits. But everybody else my grandfather's friends were all miners. And there I was doing the same as you, talking to these guys and thinking, well, they actually have a decent point. And I was policing them to prevent them from having that point. It was a kind of a difficult time for me. But you got the same thing.
It is challenging, yes.
All right,
Karen, Jerry.
We've covered Europe's wars, Middle East wars. Let's head across to Asia. Go on.
Yeah, just before we I think there's a couple more things just like to say about the Middle East. So talk about we've lost the West has lost any sort of moral superiority that the rest of the world may have once seen us with. That's well and truly gone. But there's a couple of other things. Is like you look what the Operation Prosperity Garden. So the Guardian,
Yep.
Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is the US UK's attempt to stop the Houthis from attacking shipping in the Red Sea. I mean, to me, it's a highlight that they do not have a strategy and they don't really know what to do or how to approach this problem. Like the obvious solution, I mean, how many times do the Houthis have to say it, is this will continue until the genocide, using the Houthis term, in Gaza stops. So what's the response? The day after a UN Security Council resolution about the Houthis and the Red Sea is released, and basically the tone of that was not to do anything to aggravate the situation, the United States and UK, supported by Australia as per normal, starts launching missiles at the Houthis. So, I mean, the loss of moral superiority, this is where the rules-based order versus international law comes in. It's like basically a snub to the UN Security Council, the UN Charter, etc., by striking. But it's like, what is the strategy? I mean, the Houthis have been fighting the Saudis for a long time, supported by US, UK sort of normal suspects. And they can keep this going for basically ever. How long can the US and the UK keep this going before they just look foolish? Like, they're firing $2 million missiles at $20,000 drones, etc. And then you have all these other things happening, like the UK had two minesweepers crash into each other coming into dock, like highlights a complete lack of readiness. The Germans the other day tried twice to shoot down a US drone, a Reaper drone, I think, but their missiles failed. Like it's highlighting the lack of readiness that the West actually has to fight conflict as well. So, when you're in a hole, you've got to stop digging, and I think that's what the Western world is now in. Is like, just stop doing stupid things and back
you
off
raised
a bit.
A really good point there, that the United Nations resolution specifically said not to violate the sovereign territory of Yemen. It specifically said those words, and the next day, UK and US sent jets into the sovereign territory of Yemen. Well, that's really interesting. It's basically they're saying to the United Nations, you can say whatever you like. We're going to do whatever we like. That rules-based order thing is definitely... the Chinese can't understand this at all. How come they're allowed to do that? What would they think if we were to do the same to them? This is what most of my Chinese friends actually say to me. How is that possible? How are they allowed to do that? Have you any idea where you think it might go in the Middle East? Do you think it will escalate, or do you think there might be a kind of status quo?
Once again, too many variables, very difficult to predict, but I think we could be in this sort of forever conflict. Like it could be another, Iraq or Afghanistan, where it lasts for, years and years and years. I mean, I guess there's probably, I try to read a lot, and one of the influential books I read was by Joseph Taylor. It's called The Collapse of Complex Societies. Are you familiar with it?
No.
So his basic thesis was that human societies are problem-solving organizations, and they increase in complexity to solve problems. And, that's what we've done throughout history. But at some point, the civilization can reach a point where the additional costs of complexity outweigh the advantages, and more and more problems accrue, and basically it's just more efficient to collapse to a lower level of complexity than it is to maintain the status quo. So, and Tony used a couple of examples such as the Romans to demonstrate that. And I think we can apply that to the US empire. I think that's, if we're honest, I think that's how we describe what the US is. It's an imperial system. And if you look back, I can't pronounce, and I won't embarrass myself trying to pronounce the name of the treaty, but back in, I think, 1848, when the United States had California, Texas, Arizona, etc., added to its as part of the United States.
From Mexico, from Spain.
Yeah, Mexico. So you think how minimal effort, as in the resources required to achieve that, versus the gain they got, like in a massive wealth, both in land area, the minerals, the agricultural potential in that. So, their cost, or their return on investment was enormous. And you can see this return on, that's probably, the biggest return on investment they would have had. But when they took over Cuba, the wars in Cuba and the Philippines, and that, still a really small investment to get a massive return. World War II. In World War II, the world's creditor, the only country other than Pearl Harbor that wasn't really damaged, and their casualties were relatively small. So the US ended up in a very good position, but still, I think the return on investment in their empire was getting smaller. But you look at every conflict since World War II, and what does the US gain? Korea was a stalemate. What did they gain? Vietnam was a defeat. What did they gain? Iraq was a they overthrew Saddam Hussein, obviously, in that, but they've still got some presence there. But really, what did they gain in order to cross? Same with Afghanistan. Now they've taken on Ukraine. Obviously, there's parts of the US economy doing quite well. If you work for a contractor for the military-industrial complex, you'll be doing quite well. But the everyday American's not. So they're now in that portion of imperial's, I guess, the historical trajectory where their return on investment is, I would argue, negative. And it's like the 80-20 rule. There's no getting out of it. They're trapped in that. So I think what we're going to see is that, their debt levels are incredible. They're just printing money hand over fist, $60 billion here for Ukraine and blah, blah, blah. Like, they've got so many internal problems. And I guess maybe that's what I'm thinking is that, and this is not, tomorrow or next month or whatever, but I think over the next few years, certainly over the next decade, that the US is just, it can't afford to maintain the empire it's got. And that empire is starting to contract or will contract. And that will contract because there's an alternative to it now. Like the BRICS plus, probably BRICS plus in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And so that the United States and the West will become an increasingly insignificant part of the global system. So I guess that's where I think in the big picture where things will head. But in the short term, they're doing everything possible they can to hold on to that empire. So that's what we're seeing in Ukraine. That's what we're seeing in the Middle East. That's what we're seeing in China, or against China. But they can't afford to keep doing that. So I guess my hope is that we can get through this sort of transitionary period without a major. Well, we've already got Israel and Gaza, and we've got Ukraine and Russia.
It's pretty major.
Yeah,
do you think?
Major. Do
you think we're in the dying throes? This is the empire kicking while it's in its death throes.
Well, it's definitely kicking, but when you talk about the collapse of an empire, I think like the Romans, there's a couple of centuries, 3 centuries or something. It took before it collapsed. So I think in the modern, because things are so tightly interconnected, like the complexity of our economic systems and those so tightly interconnected, I think that this will happen more quickly than what it would, in previous times. But I still think, we're talking about several decades for this process to take its full sort of process. And on the other side of that, hopefully we'll be able to build a world where we have that multipolar, where the UN Charter is respected, and I think ultimately for the people of the United States, I haven't been there, but you read the statistics and you see the stories of the average person in the United States' circumstances. They'll probably be better off when the US gives up on its empire. No doubt there'll be some rough trots in periods in the middle, but once they get through it, and that's what happened to the Romans. I think they look at the average weight of Roman citizens after the empire collapsed actually went up. I think in the longer term, there could be a brighter future, but we've got to get through this sort of intermediary period, which could be quite dangerous.
Yeah, well, you don't want too many average weights going up in the United States, by all accounts. That's the one thing they don't want.
I didn't. Okay. Good point.
On that happy note, let's move on to Asia. You're not a big fan of ASPI, and ASPI is not a big fan of me or China, for that matter. There is a perception. I've got an Australian friend who literally just came back from Australia a couple of days ago. He's come back from a different state to yours. I won't say too much because I don't want to put him on the spot. But he basically says people that he's met up with he's been back in Australia a few months after being in China for a few months. He's one of these who comes and goes. He said people in Australia have changed. They used to have a fear of China, and a fear of China buying up this and taking over that. Now he says it's a fear of when China invades, not if China invades, when China invades. So how has that perception changed so much? Because back in 2015, we signed a free trade agreement. Usually free trade agreements go along with people being pretty happy with each other. You know, you're in good friendship states, good diplomatic. Suddenly, we're only less than 10 years later, and there is a threat, there is a view that China is going to invade Australia. How did that all come about?
Well, the US has passed some legislation. I think that assigns about $300 million a year to countering Chinese. I can't remember if the Cats Act or something like that. But so they spend a lot of money to develop that narrative. And when you've got your media on side, or you're controlling the media, and you have a lot of money, it's not that difficult to. And the number one trick of propaganda is repetition. So, and I guess this is one of the things when I started to question things is you say, how often do you hear a positive news story in Australia about China, about Russia, about Iran, North Korea? Never. Does that mean, is that because those countries never do anything, newsworthy, or is that because we're trying to set a narrative? So, I think a fair bit of money and effort has been invested in generating that narrative, to the point where I think it was the Australia Institute did a survey, and I think they surveyed both Australian and Taiwanese, and the people in Australia, I can't remember the numbers, but it was a clear difference. More people in Australia thought China was going to invade Taiwan than did in Taiwan, which just shows you how effective that the sort of anti-China or China as threat narrative has been. I mean, it's clearly a ridiculous position when more Australians think that China's going to invade Taiwan than the people living in Taiwan. Can you see the mainland from Taiwan? Not far off it if you can't.
You can't see the it's 130 kilometers to Taiwan's the main island of Taiwan. There are a lot of islands, and some of them can be seen from Xiamen and that kind of area when you're there. There's a story recently in the media about American troops on Kinmen Island, which is actually Jinmen Island, depending on which language you use or which pinyin you use. But Jinmen Island is just off the coast of Xiamen, which is a mainland city. The ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, actually covers 2 of China's provinces. So effectively, every time a plane takes off or lands in either of these 2 provinces, they're inside of Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone. And one of the things that's never, ever mentioned, at least I've never seen it mentioned in Western media, is that every time Chinese vessel or Chinese flight goes into this ADIZ, they actually avoid the EEZ. So they're actually outside of Taiwan's waters, even though Taiwan is part of China and they recognize it as part of China. They're not in it. They're not going in it. They're going around it, but they're inside of this box that's been drawn on a map that says this is Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone. So effectively, it's a really strange situation. You're a military man, and I wanted to pick your brains on, do you know anything about land assaults and what's needed for a military like China to actually invade Australia? What do we need to do that? Or what do they need, I should say? I'm not Chinese.
Yeah. I did a few exercises up around Shoalwater Bay in our old Navy landing platform, amphibious, I can't remember what it's called, LPAs, Manura and Canimbla. And, they're extremely complex operations. And, the force that Australia could put ashore in short orders back then was pretty minimal and not much greater now, really, if you're compared to something like China. But I guess before I even get to that, and say, if China is a threat to Australia. So the biggest threat that China poses to Australia is it stops trading with us. So if China stops trading with us, we're stuffed. So that's to me the biggest threat that we face from China. And if we keep managing, we can have differences and disagreements, whatever. We keep trading with China. I don't think we have too much to fear from China. But I mean, it's just it's risible. It's a joke to think that China would invade Australia. Like there's so many other ways to damage Australia if you wanted to, other than invading, which you think the size of the force you need, the complexity, the risks involved, etc. It is extremely high risk. And then what's their end state? They're going to occupy Australia. Like it's an enormous land area. You'd face, or I'd imagine you'd face a hostile population. Like very, very risky. And there's nothing that I can see in the Chinese sort of national character that suggests that they're that expansionist sort of. I think we're doing a little bit of projection. If we were China, that's what we'd probably do.
I think that's exactly right. I've said the same about America. America looks at China through their own lens, and they say, "Well, this is what we would do."
Yeah,
and therefore it becomes their strategy.
And I mean, the other thing, like I guess when I started first, mid-20s, and I started to get out of those teenage, young adult years and start thinking about the world a bit more seriously and looking at our energy situation, oil in particular. And Australia imports 90% of its liquid fuels. And this country, as you know, Jerry, it's massive, thousands of kilometres. I think the length of the food supply chain is measured in thousands of kilometres, from getting broccoli from Adelaide up to Brisbane, or they'll pick mangoes up in Barwon and send them to Brisbane, then send them back on a truck again. Like it's an enormous, and that's all relying on diesel. And we import 90% of that fuel. And where does that fuel come from? Well, it all comes north of us, pretty much. So if you wanted to do something about Australia, it's another option is to and I think I haven't been tracking it quite recently, but the mega refineries that are being built in China and India, it's like that skit they had in Utopia. You've probably seen, where they've got all the generals around the table about we're going to defend our trade routes from China to China from China. Like it's almost it should be comical. Yeah, it should be. People should take the mickey out of these people who are generating this threat of an invasion, because based on my military experience, and I've never invaded a country before, so take it with a grain of salt, but I'd find far more effective ways to achieve what I wanted towards Australia other than invading it. It shouldn't be taken.
You mentioned the Chinese national psyche. It's not in their psyche. They're not expansionists. They're very defensive. And this is the thing that they've said about Taiwan as well. In particular, they have no intention of invading Taiwan, but they have no intention of allowing Taiwan to be taken away. So they will defend Taiwan. This is the wording: we will defend Taiwan. We're not going to rule out military force. You try and take Taiwan away from us, we're going to defend it, because they know very well, of course, that the only reason Taiwan wants something other than the status quo, people in Taiwan want something other than the status quo, is because they're being influenced by somebody from outside, and that somebody is a big cigar smoking Uncle Sam, and that's what's happening.
I mean, if Taiwan is 2,000 kilometers off the coast of China, would the US care? No, it's only because China is right there. It's it's that knife blade, in the side, which they can use to just achieve their aim. Same as Ukraine. If Ukraine wasn't bordering Russia, would the United States care at all about what's happening in Ukraine? No,
I think that's a very good point that you just made. It is their unsinkable aircraft carrier. They've called it that in the past. But it's actually just more than that. It's the same as Tibet was. If we go back 70 years and look at the media and the news of 70 years ago, it was all about how bad China is and what they're doing, terrible things to Tibet. Now 70 years later, Tibet can be seen by anybody who wants to go there as a very beautiful place, a fully developed place. The people there are happy. They're getting good educations, getting better lifestyles, better life outcomes as well. So clearly that's failed. That rhetoric has failed. So now they need a new one. And I think in the last 10 or 15 years. It's been Xinjiang, it's been Hong Kong, it's really just what you said before: repeat, 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 and then rinse and repeat again. That's how I see that happening.
And I guess talking about a rinse and repeat, we'll bring it back to ASPI, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, but some people call it other things, such as the Australian Sinophobia Institute and things like that. Like, you'd be aware they did those series of reports into the treatment of the Uyghurs by ASPI, and ASPI is a notionally independent organisation. Yet all of those studies were funded either by the US State Department or the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
Or Taiwan's Defense Department.
Okay, yeah.
Which gets its money from the same sources.
Independent, and then these, they got a certain amount of coverage in media organisations such as, I think, the Washington Post and the New York Times, or that, and they're cited as independent reports. So it's like that circular. We pay money to a think tank who's going to produce what we want, then we use that as independent media as an independent source to confirm, these evil Chinese are treating people badly. It's like it's so. If you did it in medical, in drugs and approval and stuff like that, I'm pretty sure you'd find yourself in court. But if you do it in a strategic policy and you're aimed at China or Russia, you can get away with it. I'm
fairly sure not one of the people from ASPI has ever set foot in Xinjiang. Even perhaps Vicky Xu, who grew up in Jiayuguan, which is very close to the Xinjiang border. There's no evidence and certainly no mention that she's ever been there. And if she had, it would have been many years ago anyways. So it's a very interesting thing that you've got all these people who are experts on it, and the one that they ridicule the most would be someone like me who's traveled extensively through there and met many people. So why do you think they do it?
Well, I think it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because they're doing it for their audience. And what I read an article just the other day. It's from Paul Greiner, who's done a whole bunch of things in the US government and organizations. And he basically said our accepted truth has become, whatever aligns with US foreign policy objectives. So if that becomes your truth, you can discard any counter information or evidence or data or that doesn't support your point of view. And I think this is part of the problem. We're living in an unreal. We're not living in the real world. Like, it's all fairy tales and made up. So I had a few debates with guys like Malcolm Davis and that from ASPI on Twitter, and funnily enough,
saw that.
So it's because we're not their audience. Like, I honestly, I think they know they're telling porcupines, but that's not what they're paid to do. And these are all information operations. Like, there's a target audience for these operations, and they're well thought through, and that they're aiming to achieve an effect, and that effect is targeted at the citizens largely of our country. So Australia,
in order to, as Noam Chomsky says, manufacture that consent that is needed. It's certainly manufactured a fear. Murdoch Press is another. I've noticed, I don't know if you noticed this or follow this, but if you were to take a spiral or a web and put different journalists in there, you find right in the middle there is Rupert Murdoch, and it doesn't matter where they work. Many of them work for ASPI and writing for the strategist. So you can see this. It all comes bound. It's very much interlinked with Murdoch and. Go on.
Yeah, well, and I agree. And there was an article I commented on Twitter the other day that was put out by ASPI, and Robbie Barwick actually commented on it. But the gist of the article was that for the good of our citizenry, our democracy, we need to control the flow of information. So I was basically arguing, and you've seen a number of these articles coming out now arguing for censorship, basically, and who's going to be the truth police sort of thing. Obviously it's going to be the people who want to sell us a certain narrative. So it's the exact opposite. I think what we need to get good policy is that open debate and of ideas rather than censorship. But it's a pretty barefaced attempt at arguing a case for censorship. And the author of that article is one of the directors in ASPI, Robbie highlighted. It was the same reporter, I think, for the Sydney Morning Herald, who made up this claim without any evidence that Vanuatu was going to have a Chinese military base. So, you can see how all these, people even move from one organisation to the other, but the narrative doesn't change because they're not journalists. They're there to sell a narrative, and I guess the good thing, that's why my comments at the start, and there's so many channels like the Duran or Brian Beletic, Judge Neapolitano, that there's so many avenues and opportunities now to, without any real effort, to find out other views, and you don't necessarily need to agree with them, but it gives you at least the opportunity to, see different perspectives on the world. Yeah. And so often it's not difficult if you've got the time and inclination. It's not difficult to work out where they're. Most of their lies are by omission. So you'll find the information somewhere and it's go, well, why don't they point that out in their article on this issue? So like the other day, another ASPI article on the impact of the war in Ukraine on global food supplies, and it says that the Russians pulled out of the grain deal, which that was through the Black Sea, which was correct. But what they don't mention is the Russians pulled out of the grain deal because the deal had two sides to it. The other side was the Europeans were going to offer the insurance and that for Russian shipping, which they didn't do. So the Russians therefore withdrew. So that power of leaving out context makes it very easy to manipulate people to a particular point of view.
Yeah, it's actually what they leave out more than what they say, which creates the misinformation. I mean, it's very easy to. I just talked to someone about the CPC or the NPC 2 sessions which are happening right now, and I just talked to someone this afternoon about this, and he said, how do they misinform us? Well, they tell the truth. Most of the time, they tell the truth. The China's growth rate was 5.2%. That's the truth. Now, how do we turn that into a bad story? By saying, compared to the 10% that they used to get. Well, yeah, that was 15 years ago. It was 2011 when China last had a 10% double-digit growth, because they had a GDP that was a third of the size of today. So instead of saying, China got 5.2% growth, we say China only got 5.2% growth compared to what they got. And it's what they leave out that's important. China got 3 times what the US got and 6 times what the UK got.
And that's the other thing, is they leave out those comparisons. Like, China's only growing 5.2%. Most of Europe's in recession. Like, they don't do those sort of comparisons. So if you look at the Ukraine-Russia war, like they never do a direct comparison, or rarely do a direct comparison between Russian and Ukrainian casualties, or they frame it in different ways. Like they'll say number of killed versus total casualties, so you can't make that direct comparison. So yes, I think this is once you start seeing these patterns, like you see them daily. Navalny in Russia obviously recently died, and between his death and his funeral, I counted something like 50 articles in Australia's ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's coverage on Navalny. And what was interesting in one of the last ones, which was about his funeral, was like all the normal, blowing up to being such a great figure and important, blah blah blah, and all his supporters and talk to that. But then, right down near the bottom of the article, it basically said he had virtually no support in Russia. They spent 50 articles talking about Navalny and his death and accusations of President Putin did it, etc. And then on one of the last articles, one of the last paragraphs, basically said he had no influence in Russia.
Simple acts of omission. There's a lot of articles today about the United Nations report on the 7th of October attack. The victims of crime in war, special commissioner, I can't remember her name. She's a Bangladeshi or Bengali. She's very interesting lady, but she's been to just recently been to Gaza, not to Gaza, to Israel, And she wrote a report which was published yesterday at a press release in the United Nations. And today the media has, there is clear evidence of rape during the October the 7th. But what it didn't say was that she didn't say that at all. What she said was, there is evidence. There's no direct evidence. There is no way that we can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. And she didn't get to speak to a single victim, because the victims have all been moved. They're no longer in places where she was. They've all gone overseas, or they've gone to different parts of Israel, or they're somewhere else. They're not where they wanted. She met with 33 different officials from Israel, but not one from Hamas. No one from Hamas was allowed to talk to her. They completely ignore that. And so the points that she does make, there's evidence that this could have happened, but only evidence that it could have happened. Not really that it's likely to have happened, not really that it did happen. There's nowhere that she says it did happen. There's no evidence. She cannot say there is evidence that it did happen. So I've just written a report about that. That was my busy morning this morning, and I sent that off to Pearls and Irritations about 4 or 5 hours ago. So yeah, it's a really interesting day in respect of wars and conflicts.
This is one thing I've sort of, learning over time, is how they build a scaffold of lies. So, no doubt you're 100% correct. You've analysed that, and it's been blown out of proportion. But if we go, 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, 3 years into the future, it'll be just an accepted fact that there's sexual violence applied, because no one goes back and very few people go back, and this is how it works. And they just keep building a scaffold.
Cameron, could be that we'll go back there if we go 6 years, 5 years into the future, we'll be looking back and saying this was another weapons of mass destruction. It's just as likely. We know that was a fake.
And I guess that's why I use the term scaffold, because that scaffold, I think, will collapse at some point. And I think the growing the growing loss of confidence in the mainstream media, and you need to replace. If you're trying to reform the system, it's not happening. It's being replaced, like the alternative media, and obviously the alternative media has risks and that associate as well. But I think it's getting enough momentum, and the cream will rise to the top. So that those people who are trustworthy, who've got good material and stuff like that, they will rise to the top, and it will replace. I think it'll largely replace. They'll fight tooth and nail to try and keep it.
Of course,
the sort of mainstream of that. But once people stop believing you, and every time, you think every day there'll be somebody just twigs saying there's something not right here, and then they'll do a bit of investigation. And once you've crossed that line and realise that most of what you hear in the media is there to manipulate you, I don't know how you go back. Like, I look at, I sort of, I'm reading the meta sort of stuff of what's in the article, what's in it, what's not in it, why are they saying this, why is this being released now, as opposed to the actual words on the paper. I think
that's how I read an article now too. I'm always looking for the between the lines. The meta language. That's a great way to describe it. The meta language. It's not there, but it's there.
And that's right. And I guess the challenge is, though, like, going to the mainstream is, things like there's a car accident, or there's been a fire somewhere, like those things. Like I'm not concerned about that, but the things with political, geopolitical angles. But the problem is, and this is why I think they succeed, is that the things I focus on are fairly narrow. There's a whole bunch of other things in the world that I have no expertise or time to investigate or whatever. So what's your main source of information? The MSM. But I guess I just go looking at that now through that filter, knowing, well, there's probably something more to this than what's being told. And I guess that's the way. If we all approach it that way, take a good hefty grain of salt, and those issues you feel strongly about, you do what you can to, I guess that's why I write and things like that. Half of it's trying to actually just work out what, in my own head, what's the truth, and what's the actual situation, or what's occurring, or why has it occurred.
I felt the same. That's why I write as well. It's kind of clearing doing exactly what you're doing. You look at this and then you say, where are the sources of this? What's the motivation behind this? And I always, do I trust my sources? I'll go to sources like the State Information Office of China. I'll go to sources of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I trust Chinese media, strangely enough. It's generally speaking quite tame, quite boring, statistical. It does have the occasional little bit of fire in the belly, but generally speaking, it's not. It's quite mediocre media, but it's factual. It's always truthful. I've never caught them in a lie yet. That's a really important thing. I can catch any Murdoch press in a lie any day on pretty much any story. Perhaps not the local car accident or the damage at the school, those local things, but definitely anything that's geopolitical. And I've come to the conclusion that I know a couple of Iranians. Iran is not as bad a place as I thought it was. I know some people who've been to North Korea. It's not as bad a place as I've been led to believe it was. So what else can you believe?
It's seeing, and that's the problem. Our brain has only got a certain capacity, so it's like you can't be across everything. But yeah, and I guess that's looking at sort of media sources, it's like you work out whether you can trust them or not over time. And I guess and that's what I'm talking about, the cream rises to the top. Like I think you look at the Duran, so Alex and Alex, I presume you're aware of those guys, and like they're they're getting massive audience numbers now. And why is that? Well, I think it's because they might not necessarily always be correct, but they're good analysis. You can see there's a lot of thought gone through. They're looking at the sources. They're looking at, that's quite often too. That's what frustrates me. We've got hyperlinks which you can put into an article, and so often when you read a piece in the media, to actually find the report from which it's come from, you've got to go find it another way. Which is like, why do they do that? Well, because most people aren't going to put the effort in.
Exactly what I did this morning. I'm scouring the United Nations, searching for this lady's name and to find the report. It was only yesterday, but I had to scour the United Nations to find it. But it was there, and it's very different to. I mean, the media has got the components of her report right. She did say there's evidence. She did say it looks like. She did say many things that cause concern about what happened on October the 7th. There's no question about that. I'm not denying these things. But what I'm saying is she didn't say this did happen. We're coming up to an hour and a quarter, which is a little longer than I thought. And it's your early evening over there. It's almost my dinner time. I want to bring up one of your posts from the other day. And it's this one. And you talk about Lawrence Wilkerson, who many people wouldn't know, but he worked with Colin Powell. He was very, very close to Colin Powell during the time of the weapons of mass destruction period. That's the same Colin Wilkerson, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And he says, the US, will initiate nuclear war. Wow.
Yeah, he was quite, that was a good interview. And he was, I was getting quite emotional compared to, I mean, I've watched him on and off for several years. And, he was getting quite emotional. Like, it was a passionate position he's developed. And I mean, what country has used nuclear weapons in the past? There is only one who's used them, in war, and we all know who that is. And I guess that's referring to my earlier comments. We're not talking about, in the West, we're largely dealing with ideologues. So rationality, I don't think is, well, I won't say they're totally irrational, but we're almost like, belief systems and almost a religious-like approach to the world. Like, it's nihilistic.
Cameron, if I can interrupt you there, I can't hear what you're saying. You've frozen, and I can. You're back. You're back. Sorry, I missed much of that answer because I was hoping you would come back. You talked about him getting emotional, and then we lost you.
Yeah. Okay. So you can hear me now?
Yeah, you're better. Yeah. Thanks.
Yep. Yeah. I'll just move a bit closer. There's only one country that has used nuclear weapons in an act of war, and obviously that was the United States. I went to the Hiroshima Museum in Japan in 2019, just before COVID, and that was quite a moving experience. I think it's the only museum I've ever been in where I had never heard anyone speaking. It was like just it's quite an eerie quiet throughout the whole thing, and like you get to the end of it, and it's like you really need to take a big deep breath. So we know how destructive nuclear weapons are, but I guess the point I was making is that I think with the leaders of the Western world and the sort of the elites, we're really dealing with ideologues. So I think we're dealing with belief systems and lack of pragmatism, and so it's almost a nihilistic position. I think where they could get to the point is like, rather than coming to terms with the fact that they're no longer dominating the world, they may resort to the use of nuclear weapons. And I guess that's the thing that scares me, is like, if you're dealing with a rational person, you can debate, you can argue, you can disagree or whatever, but you can come to a sort of a conclusion or a position or a modus vivendi or that. When you're dealing with people whose belief systems are so ingrained, and they will do anything to achieve those, even at the cost of nuclear war. That's pretty scary stuff.
Because no one's going to win that.
No, that's it. I mean, you said for Australia's, probably not target. Well, I mean, parts of Australia would be. I imagine Pine Gap would be in some of our military bases. But I mean, even if no nuclear missiles or bombs or that hit Australia, even a limited nuclear war would turn our world upside down and put at risk the very existence of our civilization. So it seems to me like a pretty logical step to try and avoid that. And I guess that's what motivates me to a large extent.
Yeah, it's kind of a worrying situation. I know that China has adapted, or not adapted, has created some weapon systems that the Americans are very afraid of. This is why they don't bring their aircraft carriers into the South China Sea. They leave them all near Japan. And I think probably the reason for that is because China has the ability with hypersonics and with what they call their carrier killer to take them out. And it terrifies me if that is going to happen, because I don't believe America would say, oh my God, we've blundered into something, we can't win here. I think they'll say, we need to escalate. And it terrifies me that this is likely to happen. I live in the Greater Bay Area. I'm one of the biggest, we are the biggest target, the manufacturing of the whole of China, the biggest manufacturing region in the whole of China.
I think the one, well, not the only, but I hope I have, is I think that the rest of the world, the BRICS countries, I think they can see this, and I think they're managing their actions. Russia could, I think, with justification, have attacked a number of NATO countries, or taken actions against NATO countries based on what they've done, but they haven't. And I think that's because they're achieving what they're trying to achieve, and they're not going to take the bait, so to speak. But I think both Russia and China, obviously, they're working closely together, and the BRICS countries as a whole. I think they're managing the sort of decline of the United States, because I think as long as we can keep, as bad as things are at the moment, as long as we can keep it sort of in this sort of semi-stable situation, time and that continued, how many times can you do a Yemen thing where you throw missiles at a country and you just get made to look foolish because it has no effect other than highlighting your own weaknesses. You do that for long enough, and even the most sort of extreme these ideologues who are sending us down this direction, you're giving them that mental time to adjust to the fact they no longer run the world. And I guess hopefully we'll, a few more years or a decade or however long it takes, and then get to the point where, all right, we need to negotiate. We need a modus vivendi. We need a new sort of arrangement. Maybe it'll be based on the UN Charter. That's the sort of hope I get.
Yeah, I talked to my wife. My wife is Chinese, of course, and I talked to her, and she says, "What's the purpose of the United Nations? What do they serve? What do they do? If they can't stop what's happening in Gaza, if they can't stop what's happening in Ukraine, what's their purpose?"
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and obviously, yeah, I guess we need to be careful of expectations, because, I mean, you just look at the structure of the Security Council, and you've got different poles, and they've all got veto powers. So you can't expect that the US or Russia or China or any of the members of the permanent members are going to do something which harms their sort of interests as they perceive it. So we need to take it a grain of salt. But if we don't have the United Nations, what are we left with? We're basically left with the law of the jungle. And I guess, so, you're familiar with Anzac Day, obviously, Jerry, every 25th of April. We have, thousands of services around Australia, commemorating our war dead and those who sacrificed their lives, families, etc., for our country, for Australia. And, they always say at the end, lest we forget. And that lest we forget was hard earned after World War I and World War II.
It was a hard lesson. We lost you again there. It seems like there's a kind of, maybe your Wi-Fi is getting tired or something. I don't know, but it's getting to that time of the day where I think we should probably call it a day. But thank you very much for a different perspective, because you're the first military man that I've spoken to, and I hear all kinds of different perspectives online, and I respect yours. The people want to follow you on Twitter if they don't already follow you. It's Leckie_Cameron, right?
That's it.
Okay, let me put that up. Leckie_. A very military thing to do, to turn your name back to front.
I didn't put a number there.
And it should come and show. It doesn't want to show for me. Yeah, I think it may be my side that's got the problem.
Yeah, it's come up now.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so it may be my side that's got the problem, but it's the first time I've had that problem since I moved into a new place a few weeks ago. So it could be mine. Getting tired. Okay, so anybody wants to follow Cameron Leckie, there you are. And war reforms, we had that war power reforms. Yeah, .org. So let me just
Australian war power reform.
There. Australian warpowersreform.org.au for anybody who's interested in learning a little bit more about that. And hopefully you'll get from here, you'll get thousands of new inquiries and some donors and subscribers, and everybody will be happy.
That'd be great.
Thank you. I'll let you get back to your evening, because I know that you have a big family there. So enjoy your evening with the family, and thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Jerry. Greatly appreciated, and I admire your work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us today. It's an awkward time of day, but we really do appreciate